The Sine Institute of Policy and Politics is American University's incubator for policy innovation. We convene leaders in the academic, public, private, nonprofit, and journalism sectors to engage and promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. In an evolving world, we seize the opportunity to work on the nation's most pressing challenges through collaboration by experts and top scholars in their field with students in research and scholarship. As part of that goal, the Sine Institute leverages American University's location in our nation's capital, the nexus of government and a growing international business center. We connect diverse perspectives from around the country and around the world with our world-class academics and research, experienced practitioners, and the most politically active student body in the U.S. We stand apart through our focus on the role of business and the nonprofit community in public policy, the rise of the importance of economic regions in the United States, and international policy issues. Our focus is to make an immediate impact at the intersection of policy and politics that leads to real and lasting change. Thank you for joining us as we convene, communicate, and collaborate. And now introducing 2023 Sine Fellow, the Honorable Mimi Walters.
Great. Well, I have a speech prepared. I'd like to say a few words. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Science Fellow seminar. My name is Benjamin Bryant. I am the Communications Director for the Sine Institute. We describe the Science Institute in a lot of different ways. One we've been doing recently is it's where the brightest minds engage to promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. It's where American University comes to convene, communicate, and collaborate. On behalf of Sine and myself, we're so pleased to have you all here for this event. Today, we are very honored to have 2023 Sine Fellow, the Honorable Mimi Walters, and her featured guest, John Kostas. Mimi Walters is a former U.S. representative who represented California's 45th district from 2015 to 2019. Prior to her election to the House, Ms. Walters served on the Laguna Niguel City Council and subsequently served at both the California State Assembly and the California State Senate. Ms. Walters possesses a background in business, finance, and government, and currently serves as Chief Commercial Officer for Leading Edge Power Solutions and as Chairwoman of Pact, which we will hear more about later on. Joining Ms. Walters today is her featured guest, John Kostas, who currently serves as CEO and Director of Pact. Pact is a leading patient advocacy nonprofit focused on advancing psychedelic research to address the mental health epidemic. Ms. Walters and Mr. Kostas have joined us on campus today to continue the critical conversation on the mental health crises in the U.S. and worldwide. They will continue to help us navigate the history of the crisis, potential solutions, and find ways to build consensus on this very important health issue. So please join me in welcoming John Kostas and the Honorable Mimi Walters.
Nice job. Nice job. Anyway, thank you all so much for coming. I know many of you have been here for the previous two classes, and this third class, I'm really extra excited to have with us John Kostas, because as we sort of explore this mental health crisis, we talked a little bit about the history and some of the challenges we face, and ultimately, how do we solve this problem? And it truly, as we've talked before, is a crisis. So I am so grateful that John is with us today. So he can share his story about what he faced as an alcoholic at a very young age and the treatment that he went through at NYU. And I think you're going to find his story fascinating. And he does not consider himself an alcoholic any longer. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, John, and you can tell the group your experience.
There you guys. Thank you. And thank you guys for setting this all up. So we have a lot of people in the room that are a lot smarter than me, so I hope I can just bear with me. But yeah, no, I never thought I would be advocating, forget mental health. I never thought I'd be advocating for that, but psychedelics as a whole, I never thought I'd be advocating for psychedelics and more research and more federal funding for it. Until I was out of options and I had exhausted everything. I had tried everything to address my alcoholism and my drinking, and I really wanted to stop, and I still couldn't. And I was just shocked at how poor all of these treatments were. And it wasn't just for me. I thought I was, treatment resistant and in the minority. I was actually in the majority of being treatment resistant. And so that, that's why I was really on my last legs here going into this. It was a Hail Mary. And I found this clinical trial and I went in here, and not only was it, and I was the best case scenario coming out of this. So not everyone had these promising results, but enough did, and the majority did. So this is, breakthrough and landmark clinical trials being done. So we could dig into that a little more, but I just wanted to give you a little background on, I was treatment resistant. I tried everything. I was drinking 20 to 30 drinks in a sitting and nothing worked. So
When did you attend your first AA meeting?
I was 16 when I went to, I think I was a sophomore in high school when I went to my first AA meeting. And I knew early on that I would have to give up alcohol or I'd be dead at, some point, and not from natural causes. So I was, that was pretty obvious to me. I had great doctors growing up. They were all telling me, this is not normal for a high school student. I grew up in New York City. I was going to bars when I was 13. And so I just, I started a little early and too fast. So I was 25. I was looking for help for 10 years until I found this clinical trial. And so I was still fairly young when I went into the clinical trial, but it really surpassed my greatest expectations.
So can you tell us a little bit about what the treatment was like? Walk us through, what the doctors did, exactly what happened to you when you went through this treatment at NYU.
Yeah. So I've been to enough psychiatrists prior to this clinical trial that this wasn't anything terribly new to me. The vast majority of this treatment is psychotherapy. So they call it psilocybin assisted therapy. And it's, the clinical trial is 54 weeks, or at least mine was. And you only have 3 psilocybin sessions. So all these sessions are bookended with psychotherapy. So before the sessions, you have psychotherapy. They call that the preparation sessions. And, this is what might come up, or this is what you might expect, or how you might feel during, because I've never taken psychedelics before and I haven't taken them since. So I had no idea what I was getting into. I thought I was going to be stuck in like a virtual reality horror film that I couldn't differentiate. I mean, that was my worst expectation of it. And the doctor said, it might not be, peachy. And that being said, a lot of the patients that we have, or the participants, the ones that do have these challenging experiences, and that's what they call, what I used to refer to as bad trips and what I was concerned about, but I'd call them challenging experiences too. The folks that have those tend to, have lasting benefits. So I think you're addressing, whatever it is, trauma, your substance use, your depression, any of these, and you have to address that, head on. And once you confront that and overcome that, it's a lot easier to deal with. So those are the preparation sessions. Then you have the actual psilocybin session, the medication session. And you go in there, at least for me, this was my trial at NYU Langone. I went in maybe 8 a.m. They drug test you. They want to make sure nothing's in your system. You know, we're dealing with addicts here. So they want to make sure you're, you know, physically fit and mentally fit too. They're like, are you mentally okay to go through with this today? And if not, we could pick another date, or you don't need to. So I said, yeah, let's, you know, do it and get it over with. And so this is psilocybin. So it's one of the compounds in psychedelic mushrooms. So it's not like they're not giving me mushrooms or, you know, magic mushrooms. Is what the kids are calling them these days. So this is synthetic psilocybin. It's very precise, and it's a lot easier for the research because you know exactly the amount you're giving the study participant. So you have a little pill. Right before you take the pill, you want to state your intention. So I knew I was there for my drinking, but for some reason, and I had a great life on the outside, great family, great friends, great job. I mean, I was in a great city, New York. I had nothing to complain about, but I was miserable when I wasn't drinking. I was miserable when I was drinking, and those were the only two worlds that I knew. So I figured, okay, if I just can calm down internally, I think the drinking's going to go away. I don't think I'm going to really need a drink. So my intention was, I just want to find an inner peace and calm down. And it's not, you know, I'm not like Mr. Zen up here. It worked. I did calm down internally, but I'm still, you know, if a bicycle is going the wrong way and I'm in Midtown Manhattan, I'm going to yell at the guy. I'm not, you know, that's so, and I was afraid of that too. I thought, am I just gonna kind of, because I grew up in New York. I liked, you know, my work ethic. I liked my, you know, little edge I had too. And I was like, am I going to lose all that? And that's what I was concerned about. I was concerned if my personality would change, or I was concerned that I might go crazy after taking this. And the doctors said, no, you know, we've medically screened you. We're, you know, they're mainly searching for schizophrenia. So you're, you know, you're mentally okay to do this trial. So, that was a little more reassuring. And I took the pill, you know, then, you know, you put on an eye mask, something you get on an overnight flight, and some headphones with, you know, classical music. And the music tended to help too, but really, you know, while the compound was really kicking in and taking its course, the music kind of influenced the whole psilocybin session, which I found pretty interesting. And I thought it would be more visuals. I thought it would, right, I'd be stuck in like a VR kind of scenario where I couldn't differentiate reality from me at, you know, NYU Langone at the hospital and on the couch. And by the way, this is all like in a hospital, but they make the room look almost like a living room. There's a couch. There are a couple of chairs like this. And so the first session I saw, while, you know, obviously the psilocybin kicked in, but I saw a glass bottle in the middle of the desert. And then all of a sudden the glass bottle disintegrated into the sand. And I was like, okay, that's pretty obvious symbolism for my addiction leaving me. And I mean, I haven't drank since that first session, and that was back in 2015. And so, and prior to that, I couldn't tie, you know, a few weeks, maybe a couple of months together. So that's how well it worked, and that's how quickly it worked as well.
So prior to you going through this process, what were some of the other treatments you had tried? Because you were, you know, very young. I mean, you're what, 33 now? I
Yeah.
mean, that was like 8 years ago. And so what had
Yeah.
you tried prior to that before you finally got to go to this trial?
Yeah. So pretty much everything. I was lucky enough. I mean, I had a supportive family. My parents wanted me to get all the help I could get. And they were like, we'll send you here, we'll send you to this doctor. I found this guy. So I tried every, different pharmaceuticals that would curb my cravings or even make you sick if you ingest alcohol, but that didn't do anything for your cravings. So it's like putting a chocolate cake in front of a diabetic and saying you can't eat that, but we're just going to keep it here. So, and growing up in New York and living in New York, you're walking by, 3 bars and a liquor store every block. So it's kind of, you're just submerged in all these temptations, really. So I tried that. I tried rehab, inpatient and outpatient. I mean, I checked into a rehab facility and the director there told all of us that we had a 3% chance at succeeding at this and staying sober. And I was shocked. I mean, I thought I might as well get a scratch off ticket or something, or play the lottery, because I thought my odds were better there. I mean, it was just crazy how this was the best form of treatment that we had. So really everything, different specialists, different pharmaceutical drugs, different inpatient, outpatient facilities. I mean, and I really wanted it. I really wanted to stop drinking. And I'm like, this is nuts. I don't understand how we don't have better solutions here.
So before you went on the trial, I mean, you didn't like psychedelics, you were afraid of psychedelics. Before you went into that trial, what was sort of like your feeling like, okay, I'm going to go into this trial? What were your expectations, and what do you think has happened to you since you've been through that trial? How's your life changed?
Well, I mean, it definitely changed for the better. Now the problems I have in life are actually, they're from life. They're not from my drinking. So, but my perspective on psychedelics was, I mean, I was scared, and I still am scared of psychedelics. That's what, when I get calls from people and they're like, should I just, go into the woods and take and I'm like, no, don't do that, because I mean, yes, they're psilocybin. You can't overdose from psilocybin mushrooms. They're non-addictive. And I think they're not addictive because they're, it's not that pleasant if you're doing this therapeutically. That's why I have no need. I'm so happy I did this, but I have no desire to go do this ever again. So I had a healthy fear of psychedelics, or maybe an unhealthy fear going into it, but definitely a healthy fear coming out of it. And my life changed. This surpassed my greatest expectations. I thought the best case scenario I'd be able to handle my cravings. And the cravings would still be there, but I would be able to handle them. They wouldn't be strong enough to take over. This virtually took away all my cravings to the point where, I still go to a bar, a few times out of the week to see friends for work. I get handed the wrong drink, maybe every other month or something at, being in these packed bars. And I've taken a few sips of alcohol over the 8 years, and it's done nothing for me. So it just eliminated all my cravings, which, I can't believe I'm even saying that, but the doctors are, the researchers are still wondering, okay, how is this working? What else? We have a lot more to learn, and how are we going to get that data?
So do you do any follow-up at all? You went through this treatment, now you don't drink. Do you have to go to any ongoing psychotherapy or
No.
any sort of follow-up?
No, nothing. No AA support groups. No, I go to a doctor once a year for a physical, but nothing. And I mean, the best way I could describe it is it was almost like an antibiotic. I did this, back in 2015, I took it a few times, psilocybin with the psychotherapy, and I'm done. So I was the very first study participant in this trial back in 2015. So I had no idea. I had no one else to talk to about this that had gone through this firsthand. I had no information, just the doctors, just the research team at NYU that were telling me, they did a study with cancer patients and end of life distress a few years before I did mine. And I had a lot of similarities with those patients of, accepting death, or I was never really, I didn't obsess over, I just got my license though, and I'm pretty cautious. I grew up in New York, so you don't need a license, but I got my license maybe like in my late 20s, and that's a little late to start driving, but your brain's fully developed by then. You're not like some 15-year-old behind the wheel. You're like, okay, I'm in a metal death trap, and this is, this could be kind of scary. But I have, a rational fear of death, but nothing crazy. And that's what a lot of those folks in the cancer study had too. And I thought that was really fascinating how there are all these similarities from, different demographics, different backgrounds, sexes, ages, races, and different mental health disorders going in, but you're having similar outcomes, but also having similar experiences in these clinical trials. And you're not doing, you're just with the doctors and that's it. It's not like you're talking to anyone else that's also going through this. So hopefully we'll be able to learn more about that. But to make a short answer even longer.
So, okay, so let's talk about the trial for a second, the results of the trial. So full disclosure, I think I shared with some of you, or I shared with you in my last class, he's actually my son-in-law. He married my daughter back in August of 2022, and 4 days before they got married, the results of his trial, which had taken 7 years.
Oh, that's right.
For
Yeah.
the results to come out. So he stayed back in New York. They got married in California, but he stayed back in New York to handle with press because the results, he was sort of the spokesperson. So share with us the results of your trial. Again, it took 7 years for them to finally get the results of the trial.
Yeah, it was a long time, and it slowed down from COVID as well. But 48%, so it was a double blind. Half the patients got the placebo, or roughly half, and the other half got the psilocybin. So that being said, everyone had the opportunity to take psilocybin, what they call open label. So everyone, it wasn't blinded. Everyone knew they were getting the psilocybin at the end of the trial, because from, their perspective and what they've seen is that so people stop drinking, or people can heal from just one session, like I did. So they just wanted everyone to have the opportunity to be able to experience it at least once. But out of the psilocybin group, I think 48% stopped drinking altogether. But in that same group, there was an 83% reduction in heavy drinking. So the folks and I thought that was almost more impressive. And throughout the trial, because I was curious about the other participants, I was like, how's everyone else doing? And they said, well, a lot of people are having good outcomes, but they didn't give it up altogether. They can just drink 1 or 2 drinks at a sitting. And I got a little upset with the doctors because I didn't know that was an option. I was like, I like to try. I'm like, I know I'm here because I need to stop, but that's it's a little extreme giving up something forever. And I'm happy I did, and then, as soon as that concern came out of my mouth, I'm like, you idiot, you're complaining that it's working. But I think that's pretty impressive that a lot of, and I think, yeah, I'm pretty sure everyone in that group, the study had 93 patients. So 40 something of them pretty much all decreased their intake. And I thought that was pretty telling. And about the double blind part, you'd think it would be obvious, but sometimes it isn't for some folks. And, you know, sometimes because the placebo was Benadryl, that, you know, that could have made folks drowsy, and that the doctors were telling me this, and I'm like, okay, and this wasn't a microdose, this is what they call a heroic dose. And I just couldn't really believe it. I'm like, you gotta know if they're giving you that high of a dose. They like doubled the average amount of a recreational dose. That's, you know, more or less. So I'm like, okay, so you're feeling a recreational dose, and now you're gonna double that. And some people still aren't gonna be convinced if they got the real thing or the Benadryl. But you know, lo and behold, that was true. And I know one of the guys that was in the trial, and it worked for him. And that's also telling on the psychotherapy part being so important. That component is extremely important, because that's the difference between, you know, doing this in a clinical setting and going to see John Mayer tour of the Grateful Dead at Madison Square Garden. So, you know, it's a little different. It could be the same compound, but the roadmap's a little different on that.
So we know that there's a lot of trials going on throughout the country. I mean, throughout the world, really, but just we'll focus in on the United States. Can you share with the group some of the trials that you know about that are treating different mental health disorders?
Yeah. So this is fascinating, because you're saying one compound, and I'm talking about psilocybin here. So psilocybin got FDA, shout out.
Yeah, shout out to the FDA, man. Breakthrough therapy.
Yeah, breakthrough therapy designation. So I think that could have been in 2018. MDMA, I think, got it a year earlier. Separate, you know, obviously separately of the psilocybin. But with the MDMA, it looks like they're mainly researching PTSD. And for psilocybin, it ranges from depression, anxiety, substance use. So whether it's alcohol use disorder, whether it's smoking, using it as smoking cessation, which, by the way, that had, I think, an 80% at Hopkins right down the road, 80% efficacy for smoking cessation. And the leading method right now for that's currently approved is maybe 30%. So that's more than double. And granted, these are small sample sizes, but still, it's pretty exciting. So, right, they're looking at it for opioid use disorder. They're looking at it right now at Wisconsin for methamphetamine use disorder, which is supposedly a lot tougher than some of these other substance use disorders. There aren't too many treatments really, if any. So there are anorexia, eating disorders, OCD. And so what the research world is learning is that maybe these mental health disorders have a lot more in common than we all initially thought. So there could be something there as well. If you have the same protocol, more or less, using the same compound for these different mental health disorders with similar outcomes and efficacy. So that's exciting times.
So what do you think is the biggest challenges for this research?
Well, you know, according to the doctors that we talked to in the different universities doing this research, the Schedule I designation certainly doesn't help But I think the bigger challenge than that is because this research is being done. I think the greatest challenge for them is the limited federal funding going towards this. And, you know, as these clinical trials, the more and more or the better outcomes they have, right? A phase 1 could be, I'm just ballparking it, a couple $100,000 to $1 million or $2 million, right? And then the phase 2s, maybe a few million to, you know, higher single-digit millions, and then the phase 3s, you know, maybe around 25 million or so. So the better results you have, the more money you have to put into this to keep up with all of this. And I think it's really limiting them to do this research because of the lack of federal funding for it. And I think since 1970, since the Controlled Substance Act, there have been about 3 government grants going towards psychedelic research, and that all came within maybe the last year or so. So we're getting there. The doors are opening, but I think that's the researchers, and from all the researchers I've talked to, it's more so the federal funding than the drug designation, the drug scheduling, which, you know, is still an obstacle, but they're doing the research. They just need to work with the DEA as well for that.
So obviously, there's a lot of hope that this type of treatment can solve a lot of problems we're facing in mental health crisis. And I know that you dedicated your life to helping further this cause. Can you share with the group some of the work that you're doing with lawmakers and some of the challenges, I guess, with other groups out there that we're facing with the decriminalization and the legalization side of this? And, you know, what are sort of the messaging that we need to have move forward to get some support from lawmakers?
Yeah, and so the research community as a whole is very concerned about the decriminalization movements, the legalization movements, because of medical risks. The lawmakers are concerned about those movements because of political risks as well as the medical risks. So if you get lawmakers that want to see changes and improvement in mental health treatments, and they see this as a viable solution to explore and get the government behind, they see it as a political risk, though, because it could get out of hand pretty quickly, like it did in the 1970s. There was just as good research, you know, from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and then the drug escaped the lab, and it was a bipartisan, Nixon, right, the Republican in the White House, but Congress and the Senate, the House and the Senate, was controlled by Democrats at the time for the Controlled Substance Act. So it was a bipartisan issue to just shut it all down. And I don't think that was their intent, to kill all this promising research. It was a byproduct of shutting down the counterculture and the protests with the Vietnam War. But still, it was a big byproduct of that. And so that's why it's been decades. I mean, this was 50 plus years ago, and and how am I the first person to do this for alcohol use disorder in 2015? I mean, it's really crazy. That's how much time was, wasted. So, I think a lot of the decriminalization folks, legalization folks, I think they mean well, and I think for the most part, but I think the risks outweigh the rewards here. And we are so close to FDA approval. we're so close to getting a lot more federal funding going towards this research. And, you know, what these could do is just blow the door off, and people doing this in an unsafe way. And it could really backfire. So those are our concerns. Those are the concerns of the researchers. Those are the concerns of the lawmakers that we're working with and the decision makers. I'm sure those are some concerns from the FDA, but you want to do this in clinical settings and get the data and, you know, do this in a safe way and limit the variables, limit the risks involved. So I think that's the biggest challenge.
So I'm going to ask you one more question, then I want to open it up to you all to ask questions. So currently, you are very instrumental in starting a bipartisan caucus on Capitol Hill with Congressman Lou Correa from California and Jack Bergman from Michigan. Lou's Democrat, Jack is Republican. And can you share with the group some of the things that the caucus, and by the way, it's called Psychedelic Assisted Therapies Caucus.
Psychedelics advancing.
Psychedelics
Therapy.
advancing therapies. I think I say it wrong. Anyway, it's called the Path Caucus, PATH. It's easier for me to remember acronyms. Share with the group some of the things that the Path Caucus is doing. And it was just started in the 118th Congress. So it was just literally
Brand new.
And it's historic, never happened before.
Mhm. And you mean you were instrumental in?
Yeah, well, okay, so because I have some relationships on Capitol Hill, John came to me and said, could you help us form a caucus? It was his idea. He had a couple of colleagues of his, it came to me and I just assisted them in helping get it formed.
Well, yeah, and that's a very good sign because, right, General Bergman, former general in the Marine Corps, is the co-chair on the Republican side, Congressman Lou Correa on the Democrats. And they are very well liked across the aisle, which is tough to find these days. And so I think that's a very good sign that you're getting quality co-chairs to lead this charge in Congress that are respected, that people want to work with. And what they want is they see that this research is working for a lot of folks. And what they want is to have the government support these researchers, the universities, the study participants, as much as the government can. So they're doing everything from working on federal funding to this, removing or reducing any unnecessary barriers to more research, but not in an unsafe way and not to sidestep the FDA. They want to do this the whole, you know, throughout those guidelines, because they see this as being promising and they know that we need to learn not only, you know, how this works, but what else this can work for. And maybe why does this work for some people or most people in these trials? And maybe why doesn't this work for the others? So there's still a lot to learn, but they understand that we're not going to learn any of this, or it's going to take us a lot more, you know, it's going to take us another 50 years to learn this without the federal government coming in, especially with these phase 3 clinical trials approach. And, you know, some have already started, but that's, you know, $30 million a trial or so. So it's been dependent on philanthropy and private, you know, funding. And it's gotten us this far, and, you know, we need the federal government to really take it across the finish line.
With that, thank you. So I'll open up the questions.
Thank you.
Anybody have any questions?
Could you talk a little bit more about the therapy component?
Yeah.
How it might have been similar or different to things you had done to try to fit before?
Yeah, absolutely. So they use cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, as the top therapy. with this. And I think it was 4 sessions of that. So I met with the doctors on a weekly basis, once a week. And then you do, 4 sessions, and that's like a month in. And then you do your psilocybin session. And then the next day, you have a debrief. They call it a debrief session. You kind of go to the doctors after the drugs were off, and you're like, you tell them what you experienced, what do you think it meant, what, like the glass, I mean, that's pretty obvious symbolism at Bend, but they saw that too, and they were like, oh, yeah, I think, this could work. I'm like, you think it's working? I feel different. Like, I felt almost like a weight was lifted off my shoulder. Like I physically, not metaphorically, I physically felt lighter, which was crazy, and weird to say. But so I had felt different, and in a good way, but I was still I was almost shell-shocked after that first time, because I had never experienced psilocybin, certainly at that dose. It's a high dose. And so having the doctors there kind of walk you through what they think it might have meant, or, giving you some guidance on all that was incredibly helpful. And then you do a few more weekly sessions, and then about a month later, I did my second psilocybin session. And then that was followed up, I think, with a few more weeks of talk therapy, all cognitive behavioral therapy. And that's why, I think I alluded to this earlier, that it wasn't really anything different than I had done earlier. And with the talk therapy part, this was all, the only thing that was different was those psilocybin sessions in the middle of all of these therapy sessions. So, but that's, it's really, you got the talk therapy, you got the psilocybin session, and then more talk therapy. Is real, there's how they did it.
Going off that, would they do talk therapy with you while you were taking the drugs, or were you just kind of left alone to fail?
Yeah, that great question. For MDMA assisted therapy, you do an active talk therapy session. So from my understanding, and I think we got the neuroscience, the amygdala, is that where fear is in this?
Yeah, that's a part of it.
Right, okay, so thank you, doctor. So what that therapy does is it kind of tones the amygdala down, and for the PTSD participants, they can talk about and go through these traumatic experiences that got them in the room in the first place. And but they could do it in a non-fearful way. And even after the drug wears off, they can still carry that with them into everyday life, decades down the road, some of these folks. So that, has an active psychotherapy session. The psilocybin does not. I had the headphones with the music, the eye mask, and I was just, and I thought that was pretty interesting, because that just tells you that, everything that you need to work on, you kind of know subconsciously. That's how I took it. Because I was coming up with these realizations. I'm like, this isn't working for you, the drinking. Like, why don't you just stop? And it was almost that easy. These realizations that I would come to almost on my own. But so I think it's interesting how a lot of that work being done is internal and, within you. So yeah.
Cool, thank you.
Throughout your course of being, treated with psilocybin, were you able to, or were the doctors able to monitor how your brain was physically changing at the neuroscience level, prior to psilocybin and during the course of your treatment? It'd be interesting to see, of course, there are changes that make your desire to not have alcohol zero. That's, if I understood that correct.
Yeah.
Were you able to see images of your brain? That's.
No, I asked that too, because this was so early on, and I don't think they had the funding for it yet. They couldn't do that, but I think they might have done it with some of the patients later on. But I was asking them, I was like, can we see, because I looked at myself as a, guinea pig. And I was like, I was an anchor at the time, so I was a journalist, and I was like, this is just a crazy story if this ends up working. You're telling me a Schedule I drug would cure an addiction to another drug, being alcohol. And I was just like, this is wild. So I was really enthusiastic about the research and the science behind it, and why the doctors didn't really know how it's working or not. But for anyone interested, there's a brain scan. They put a brain not on drugs compared to a brain with under the influence of psilocybin, and that looks like, and it's Robin Carhart Harris, I think, he's a British researcher, but now at UCSF in San Francisco, and that brain on psilocybin just looks like you gave, a 5-year-old 10 crayons and they just scribbled all over that. And that's, you could probably explain this better than I could, but
Activated brain.
yeah. So, and a lot of compartments and different, parts of the brain that usually don't interact as much or communicate with each other are starting to interact. And they, I think that just gave me different perspectives, because I would always look at my drinking as a journalist. I'd say it was a subjective disease. So I would always justify my drinking, whether I'm not hurting anyone but myself, or I'm still young enough and I got plenty of time to clean up my act, or, whatever it was. I had a million excuses for it. But what this therapy helped with was it let me see my drinking objectively for the first time. And I, saw it, and I was like, and I just felt terrible of, what my parents, they must have been. It was like probably watching a slow car crash, and they were just helpless. So, my parents, my family, my friends, and I just felt awful making them, feel all this worry for me. So it kind of sobered me up in a way.
Hi, good afternoon.
Hi there.
Rose Wilson. I'm a master's candidate in the School of International Service. So thank you guys for being here and, sharing this really important message and having this conversation. I just wanted to ask, so considering, the whole war on drugs and how that's been criminalized and racialized for minority groups, how does your organization and the work that bipartisan program plans to kind of address that in terms of access to these life-changing therapy and programs?
Oh, great question. So that's why we're doing this on a federal level, because ultimately it looks like, and I don't want to jinx anything, but it looks very good for FDA approval. The results look good, breakthrough therapy designation, all that. So we want to continue to have that in a safe manner. But to really make this accessible, you need to do this on a federal level so insurance can cover this at some time. Look at cannabis. You got medical marijuana in almost 40 out of the 50 states, but insurance isn't going to cover that. So everyone's paying out of pocket for that for medical use. So to really make this accessible, you gotta do this federally, it's gonna take longer, but you know, I'm young, so I got time.
And that's why having some of the decision makers willing to put their names out there and form this caucus. Our job really now is we have to do a lot of education to members of Congress, so that they understand what this treatment is and the success behind this treatment. I mean, we're starting almost at ground zero. When I was in Congress, and it's been, I left in 2019, we weren't having these discussions. And, you fast forward now to 2023, and now we've got a caucus and we've got active discussions going on Capitol Hill. It's pretty remarkable that if we do this correctly, and again, we bring in that decriminalization and that legalization aspect of it, the way it's not going to happen is if that message gets out there and then your decision makers run away because they're worried about their reelection and they're worried about what could happen. And if we're able to just keep it very tight and say, listen, we're looking for this treatment under medical supervision, we believe that we're going to be able to get enough decision makers on our side that we will ultimately get support from a congressional level. But it's going to take time. But that's really what our goal is.
My next question has to do with just the pileup of these instances where you have alcohol, and I know psilocybin can treat, of course you said anorexia, OCD, methamphetamine. Is the more drugs or the more substances you have in your system, does that detract from the effect that psilocybin has? So, we worry about fentanyl in today's cases where Narcan, of course, can help, but not on all instances where you have multiple drugs at play in that one system being the body. Is the way that psilocybin work and its effects dependent or can really depends on the amount of drugs or the amount of alcohol that you have in the system, or does it work equally all across the board? Does that make sense?
So would your past drug use interfere with the effects of this,
Yes, so you have like other drugs,
or like currently in the system?
all drugs, meth, whatever else is in your system that kind of affects the way psilocybin works.
I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if it could.
Okay.
But in the clinical trials, they ask you to not
They don't want.
do any. So they asked me not to drink 11 days before my clinical trial, or my psilocybin session. So I literally circled the day in the calendar and counted backwards 11 days. And I was like, all right, this could be it. And that was my last night of drinking. And it was also my sister's birthday, but I skipped that and drank by myself like a good brother. And
that was the last time that you had actually drank.
yeah. And so they wanted my system to be clear of all that. I know there's some debate over SSRIs, antidepressants, and with either psilocybin. I've heard people go down to South and Central America for ayahuasca retreats. They want you to, I think the majority, I could be wrong because I haven't done one of these, but they want you to kind of wean off your antidepressants. They think that could interfere. That being said, some researchers think you could stay on your antidepressants through this. So, and that's how early this all is. And that's why we do need more research, because it would be great if you could do this therapy while still on an antidepressant that's working for you, or, you're on some other medication that's working for you. So yeah, I think the jury's still out on that and they got to find out. Yeah.
So I know you all spoke briefly about about like your specific hallucination, but how do those hallucinations differ for patients who take psilocybin for anxiety and depression? What's their experience typically like?
That's a great question. And so granted, I think there are only a few hundred of us that have gone through this in clinical trials. So, and I don't know, maybe I can count on one hand the folks that have gone public with this too, because you got the stigma of mental health and the stigma of psychedelics with it. But from what I've heard in, crossing paths with a lot of these folks, there are still some similarities with just overall, you had some folks doing this for healthy normals is what they were studying, just to see how this works in the brain, had similar experiences to cancer, end of life distress. So what, my second or third, I think it was my second session, I had a death experience. So I was watching myself in real time. I was in Bellevue Hospital and I was on the couch and I was watching myself from a bird's eye view and I died. But it was it was weird, very weird, but it was probably the most peaceful part of all these clinical trials. And that, a lot of the anxiety and depression, clinical trials, those study participants had similar death experiences. And then you get to, I was talking to a reporter from the Wall Street Journal, and she said, this sounds like a similar outcome that people have with near-death experiences. So people almost dying actually, and they change, like I went into the nonprofit world and I'm like trying to get this, to more people through research and trying to learn more about this. And people have had similar life trajectory changes that they go into, service or whatever it is, become a teacher. So I think that's pretty interesting. There's a lot of similarities with the near-death stuff and a lack of, fear as well, which is, lack of the fear of death, kind of like irrational fears of death. For example.
Do you view this like the death of like your own self then, in a sense, like, but then like in a different way, like even though like transformation that death experience is like, you view it differently, like almost like how where like that chapter ended?
Yeah, very weird to say it. So I was listening to my tape. So they recorded all of this and I was listening to the tapes because I kind of forgot. It's been 8 years. And I said to the doctors right after, I was like, this is almost like a new chapter, but forget the chapter. This is basically a new book. So it was like totally, but I'm still the same person. I'm just, which is strange. So yeah, definitely the old self was killed off and the addiction. Did you?
Yeah, so you had profound behavioral change.
Yeah.
And that usually is accompanied by profound brain change. And in your case, it seemed to be quite selective in the sense that you had one particular addiction and it miraculously, and when I say miraculously, we don't understand the mechanism.
No, yeah.
Right? Yeah. But usually those kinds of changes are going to be accompanied by other things as well, right? So, for example, we've known a long time that we could take out the area of the brain that is responsible for reward. Unfortunately, it takes out all kinds of reward, right? That apparently didn't happen to you. You still get rewarding aspects of your life. Or you can take out an area of the brain where it's responsible for fear, but then you take out fear of almost everything, which is also not very adaptive. So my question is, have you had any kind of how should I say, you said you had these profound changes, not just the alcohol, you felt like a new person in a sense.
Yeah.
Have you had any kind of what you might feel as not beneficial effects?
No, and I always ask that too, because I'm always curious, does everyone have a similar outcome as I do. And also because now I'm involved in this world professionally, I want to know, I don't want to walk into things blindly, and I know I'm anecdotal, but so I want to know how the other participants did. And I'll always ask a doctor or a researcher, have you had any patients or participants leave worse off than they entered, the clinical trial? And they have not. There are folks that it does not do anything for, unfortunately, and it doesn't work for, but so far, no one has left with the clinical trials. So I was talking to a doctor last night actually, and they just published a study, and they said 3% of folks doing this outside of clinical settings have needed to seek medical or psychiatric help because the distress was too much. So, and that's outside of clinical settings. So even though that's a small number or small percentage, I get those calls a lot because we also help people find clinical trials. And a lot of these folks wanted to go straight, to doing this, thinking that it would be similar standards of care that you would get in a clinical trial, which it's not. So I'm always asking if there are any, I've heard about bad outcomes outside of the clinical settings, but nothing yet from inside.
Just one more follow-up.
No, yeah.
I have it. So there's data being accumulated that addictions are really involved, again, it's speculative.
Yeah.
Involved memory disorder in the sense that you can't suppress the memory of the rewarding consequences of whatever it is you're addicted to. And it also can be that you don't remember the bad consequences as well.
Yeah.
And so I guess what I'm wondering is, do you actually remember what it was like? Do you actually, when you were drinking, about the consequences, or has that been difficult to recall?
I really have to force myself to recall it. And I really,
Before.
so before it was, I'd wake up and I felt like the anxiety, like I had just murdered a whole, innocent family and their puppy. And I didn't do anything wrong the night before. I was just drinking by myself, but I had that guilt of, and shame of, really bad things. So that would usually last me a couple of weeks, but, then it would kind of wear off and I'd convince myself, okay, I've been good the last few weeks, I could drink again, and it would be the same old story. But now this treatment works so well for me that I need to really take a lot of effort to get back to how I felt going into this trial and living with the addiction and trying to, because when I'm talking to folks every day, it's almost tough to relate to them now in a weird way, because I was right there with them. I was the same way going into these clinical trials, looking for some sort of solution. And again, I was a best case scenario coming out, and I'm very lucky for that. But it worked so well that it's tough for me to relate sometimes with the addiction and the disease in an odd way, right?
One more question and then.
I know you have a training catch, John, so maybe do one
Yeah,
more.
Oh, yeah.
You mentioned that you could now perhaps even have a drink and it
Yeah.
did not do anything which bad to you, which I find particularly remarkable.
Yeah.
But I'm curious to know if you can talk about that. How did your addiction start? Like you randomly had a drink and then you could not stop anymore?
Yeah, were you?
No.
Well, I started, so we didn't, and the doctors were saying, oh, do you have to?
Thank you.
Yeah, no, all good.
Yeah.
The doctors were telling, myself, my parents, that it's either hereditary or, and another thing was I was too young. I started way too young. And I never really had a normal relationship with alcohol. So I started at a young age and I always drank to get drunk. I'm, you know, a little older now, but I don't really understand people just drinking to, like, I'll see some guy with, you know, a drink and the guy's still holding the drink 45 hours later, the ice is melted. I'm like, are you gonna just look at it? Or so I still don't get that, you know, right? Right, I mean,
So you started drinking at how old?
I start like 12 was, you know, my first drink, and then I was going to bars at 13, 14, and I was always hanging out with the older kids. And so it, you know, it was kind of a social aspect of all of that. And then for me,
development during that time.
yeah, exactly. And for me, it was, I would be able to handle it back then, but I would love to go out and drink and have fun and I'd be fine. And then it was almost like it snowballed out of effect where I just woke up one day to try to slow down and I realized I couldn't. And it got to a point that every time I drank, I would black out and I wouldn't remember what happened the night before. I'd wake up in my bed not knowing where I was or how I got back that night. It was, I mean, if any of you seen Memento, the movie, it was almost like that. I would write myself text messages and I'd be like, okay, you're fine. Like the drunk me, like Jekyll and Hyde, but like, you're fine. You got home all right. You didn't, like, nothing bad happened. Don't worry. No anxiety the next day. So it just snowballed out of control, and it's a very progressive disease where it was all fun and games up until it wasn't, and now it's about 18 or 19 years of age for me. So it's maybe 5 or 6 years of being fine.
Oh,
Gotcha.
thank you.
Thank you.
But thanks everyone so much for coming. It's a fantastic discussion. Really appreciate you coming, John.
Thank you.
Of course, Ms. Walters. Ms. Walters has a career con coming up, excuse me, on April 18th at 4 p.m. where you can learn about her career path and get some advice on your future. As for our stuff, we have some of the stuff coming up with the fellows as well. There are going to be 2 in-person career conversations next week on April 4th in the Mary Graydon Center with former Arizona Governor Doug Ducey and NPR Executive Editor Terrence Samuel. So please sign up today. It's all over. I ask you all the time on social media to sign up. You'll see it. You'll figure it out. Thank you, everybody.
And if any of you know somebody who's suffering and wants to get into a clinical trial, what Apollo Pact does is through John, he gets people submitted to participate in clinical trials. So you can reach out to me and we'll make sure that you have John's information. So if you know anybody, so just keep that in
All
mind.
confidential.
Yeah, all confidential. Okay.
Great. Let's get those.